Good morning, distinguished guests, Dr. Gold, Dr. Hansel. Today's conference will deal with the compatibility of international law with dealing with terrorism, the most relevant subject in this era in which terrorist acts are performed against countries by organizations operating across borders that operate outside the territory of the country which they damage. And several questions come up in this context. What may the country which is damaged do and what it may not do against that terrorist organization? The terrorist organization and its members, is it somehow bound by international law? And to use their obligations, can we have any means of enforcement? Another question, can we see members of these organizations, fighters, combatants, which are bound by international law on the one hand, but on the other hand also benefit from the defense which are applicable from international law? And the answers to these questions will be dealt with by the members of the first panel. I'd like to introduce the panelists now. The first speaker is Mr. Daniel Taub, the Director of the General Law Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He specializes in enforcement against terrorism, international organizations, and humanitarian international law. In addition, he was involved in the peace process in the Middle East as a member in two delegations, one the Israeli delegation to the peace talks with Syria, as well as the Israeli delegation to peace talks with Palestinians. He studied in Oxford, London, and Harvard. He often speaks in many places all over the world regarding international law and theories of negotiations, and he will discuss legal and military issues pertaining to the management or conducting of an operation such as Cast Lead. He will explain why it is very difficult for Israel to have a genuine dialogue with various players on these subjects. He will be followed by Professor Yoram Dinstein, a professor of law in the Tel Aviv University, and he used to be the president of the university. Professor Dinstein is one of the most renowned experts on laws of war, and today this field is called humanitarian law. Professor Dinstein used to be the head of the Israeli chapter of Amnesty International. He was also a member of the board of directors of the famous prestigious organization American Society of International Law. Professor Dinstein taught international law in the American Naval College and was a fellow researcher in Max Planck, the German Research Institute. Professor Dinstein wrote endless books and papers, and his recent book was recently published by Cambridge Publishers, and it's called International Law of Belligerent Occupation. Professor Dinstein is going to talk about the topic of this panel, which is international law limitations in handling the war on terrorism. Our third speaker will be Professor George Fletcher from the Columbia Law School. He's not here in the panel because he couldn't make it today. Therefore, we will see him on screen today. On these screens, Professor Fletcher is an international known expert on international law, constitutional law, and international relations. He has published over 100 legal papers and a great number of books, and he's one of the most often quoted law professors in the U.S. He often speaks outside the U.S. as well, and it's very interesting that he usually speaks in the local language because except for English, he is well known in his wonderful ability to speak and read French, Russian, Spanish, German, Hebrew, Hungarian, and I probably dropped a few languages. Today he's going to talk about enforcement of international law regarding individuals who breach the war laws. Our fourth speaker is Professor Gerald Steinberg, the Executive Director of the Monitor NGO, and he is the chairman of a political science in Bar-Ilan University. He focuses on diplomacy in the Middle East, politics of human rights, Israeli politics, and arms control. And he's going to talk about the various uses used by NGOs in international law in order to obtain certain goals. And our last speaker is Dr. Roy Scheindorf, who works as a legal consultant consultant to Debevoise and Plimpton, one of the leading law firms in the world in international law. Dr. Scheindorf also teaches a course in the Hebrew University on international humanitarian law, and next year he's going to teach also in the Tel Aviv University a course on human rights law. And he wrote his PhD, which deals with criminal international law in the New York University. He has published several papers on today's topic, and one of them is Extra-State Armed Conflicts. Is there a need for a new legal regime? In this paper, he has proposed that international law will recognize a new category of armed conflicts, conflicts between states and non-state entities that are conducted at least partially outside the borders of the said state. And he will be speaking about several of the topics mentioned in this paper I just mentioned. Each speaker will be given 20 minutes. And please don't take more time than you have, because we have 5 speakers, including the video link. And at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. But please, if you can write your questions, there are papers and pens on each table, and towards the end of this session, people will go around the table and collect any questions if you have, and if you wish to write your name on the paper, that's fine. Anyhow, the questions will be discussed. The questions that were collected from you will be discussed. Thank you very much, and you may begin, please.